Hello and welcome to Scream Scene, the horror movie podcast where we watch every horror movie ever made in chronological order and then we rank them from best to worst. My name's Sarah.
And I'm Ben.
Thank you so much for listening to us today. How are you, Ben?
You know, I'm surprisingly well.
Yeah, yesterday was not good for you.
No, I got very suddenly, violently sick yesterday.
Pretty sure it was food poisoning.
And today I feel basically fine.
Well, that's good.
How are you feeling?
I'm feeling patriotic.
Oh, sure.
It is Canada Day, and as Ben set up in the previous episode, we are watching our first Canadian horror movie today.
Yeah, it just sort of worked out that with our recording schedule, today was a good opportunity to record because we have the day off. And so, yeah, today's Canada Day, and we have a Canadian film.
I'm excited about this movie. I'm excited about this episode. But before we dive in, it's 1961. How is this our first Canadian movie?
Right?
What the heck?
So, dear listeners, if you aren't familiar, Sarah and I are Canadian. Castle Scream Scene is located in Calgary, Alberta. And Sarah and I first met in a film studies class in university. And
we're going way back. Okay.
We both have background in like some film studies education. I have a degree in film studies, and I also have my education in film production. I've worked as a filmmaker. I've worked as a film curator. So I know a lot about the history and current day nature of the Canadian film industry. And there's probably, unless you're Canadian, a good chance that you're not as familiar. Heck, there's a good chance if you are Canadian that you aren't super familiar with the history and realities of the Canadian film industry. So to answer the question of like, how is it 1961 and this is the first Canadian film we're covering on the show, especially when we ourselves are Canadian, especially when, if you're a horror fan, I feel like you should have some awareness that like Canada has a strong and proud tradition of horror movies. We're going to need to tell you a little bit about the Canadian film industry and what it looked like in 1961. So, Sarah, do you want to walk us through that history?
Absolutely.
Starting with Canada is a different country from the United States.
So before anyone actually's us, I want to make it clear that on paper, the very first Canadian horror movie ever produced is 1913's The Werewolf. We've mentioned it on the podcast before, particularly when we covered Wolf Blood, which I think was like in the 20s. Mm-hmm. It's a lost film, so we can't cover it.
Yeah, it could be anything.
That's the other thing. It could be anything. Same with like London After Midnight. It has a reputation, but Wolf Blood also had a reputation that it did not meet.
Yeah, exactly. Like people are always like, oh, look at like The Man Who Laughs, such a horror film. Like, come on. Anyways, so...
Sure, Jan.
Right, exactly. So we are aware of Wolf Blood. We are aware of The Werewolf. Don't actually us. Mm-hmm. But it also kind of, for practical purposes, does not count.
To tell you about the Canadian film industry in 1961, I'm going to go back to the beginning of the industry in Canada. The very first Canadian films that were produced and screened in 1897. These were done by a Manitoba farmer named James Freer. And amongst these home movies, as he called them, were films like Arrival of the CPR Express at Winnipeg.
The train's coming right at me.
Or 6 binders at work in a 100-acre wheat field.
The binders are coming right at me.
Trans masks shaking their boots. Those are not the kind of binders. They're agriculture machines. So it's very focused on like, here's the world around me as a rural farmer. That trend of documentary continued with the CPR, so Canadian Pacific Railway, hiring a British company to produce a series called Living Canada, which was done in particular to promote immigration from the UK to Canada. So that documentary, travelogue, pro-immigration, pro-tourism focus continues from that origin all the way even to the present. The first Canadian feature-length fiction film is Evangeline in 1913. And even that is a fictional story adapting a poem that's about the Acadian expulsion. So even that is like fiction based around a factual event.
Right. When the French-speaking Acadians were expelled from Maritimes Canada, and a bunch of them went down to live in the southeastern United States, and the Acadians just became Cajuns down there. Yeah,
it's true. There's a really good documentary. I want to say it's by Les Blanc, but it's about the chef making like crawfish and stuff. And in this thick Cajun accent, he talks about how like we brought the lobster from Nova Scotia all the way down with us, and it just got smaller as crawfish as we came down. Now, the very first movie studio in Canada was in 1917 in Ontario, because everything got very focused based on provinces, as well as censorship boards, which we would see later on with like ratings boards. We rate based on provinces here. And that movie studio's mandate was to produce films that would advertise Ontario.
Ontario is the largest province in eastern Canada. It is a majority English-speaking province. It is probably the most like heavily populated province in Canada, and certainly back then it certainly would have been. I'm just giving context because I don't think people know a lot about Canada.
No, like that's fair. Like for the longest time I thought Ohio was like more Midwest, but it's actually pretty far east. Or maybe it's the reverse. I forget now.
Yeah, the point is like don't feel bad for not knowing things about Canada.
Yeah,
but you know we'll have your back throughout this episode.
Yeah, we'll do our best. Film in Canada, by and large, even today, is subsidized by the government. Today, you really see it in tax subsidies and grants. In 1918, we saw the creation of the Canadian Government Motion Picture Bureau. It was the first national film production unit in the world.
Nice.
Its purpose was, quote, of advertising Canada's scenic attractions, resources, and industries. Now, unfortunately, the Bureau was like, why do we need sound? We're just making documentaries. So they finally made the transition to sound pictures in 1934, but by then...
Oof, that's late.
It's fucking late. For context, The Jazz Singer came out in 1927. So because of that, like the Bureau really lagged behind, and it was like really struggling to do anything of worth, to be blunt.
And, you know, at the end of the day, the thing you have to understand with like Canada and our struggles in the film industry, it's similar to Britain. And we've talked in the past about like what Britain did to combat American hegemony. But like we're right next door and we speak the same language and we have basically the same culture. So like, you know, it's very easy for American films to have that kind of power over what we do.
Now in World War I, there was a big boom for newsreels that were by Canadians at the Western Front. But when the war ended, that dried up. There was a minor boom with seeing success tied to one individual whose name is Ernest Shipman. He's a Canadian producer and promoter. He had a hit with 1919's Back to God's Country, which was filmed in Calgary.
Yes.
Also saw a lot of success because it featured his wife naked.
Listen, the things that make films successful are timeless.
He would later adapt Canadian novels, but his last picture in 1923, which had Norma Shearer, didn't really see anything, and he kind of died in obscurity. So to have your only minor boom be tied to one person, that gives you an idea of what the industry looks like in this time. Canadian film, both feature and shorts, are struggling during this time in like the 20s, while American film was like, ooh, Canada's close and has some like, maybe not exotic, but like foreign things like Mounties and moose. So they would come to Canada to shoot on location and use some of our iconography. At the same time in the 20s, as the Canadian film industry is really struggling to do anything, there was a U.S. monopoly on the Canadian distribution and exhibition in our own country. So the American studios established the Canadian Motion Picture Distribution Association, which are really just a group of their Canadian offices. That meant that they had a monopoly on the distribution of any film into Canada, and the American-owned Famous Players Corporation purchased the majority theater chain across Canada, meaning that they had a monopoly on exhibition across the entire country.
That's right. And remember that until the Paramount decision in 1949 or 1950, Famous Players was vertically integrated with Paramount Studios, right? So yeah, American films, American studios, American monopoly.
Now, Canada is a Commonwealth country, which means that the Queen is a figurehead, but we're still kind of considered part of the empire. And as a Commonwealth country, this was Hollywood's foot in the door to Britain's Quota Quickie Act. So any films that were made in Canada were typically made by Americans to potentially get distributed into Britain as part of a Quota Quickie, or the British would come to Canada, film here, and then distribute in Britain. Those two countries are where the focus on distribution and exhibition goals are. Canada just happens to be stuck in the middle.
And like to this day, a huge portion of our industry is what's called service productions, which is when another country comes here and shoots here and uses our resources and crews, but it's not for a Canadian film.
Yeah. Louis Selznick famously said, "If Canadian stories are worth making into films, American companies will be sent to Canada to make them." Which really hurts. Now, typically around this time, we're seeing what would later be described as documentary dramas. So they're documentaries, but they might have a fictionalized element to it, fictionalized people that we can follow as the events are unfolding, that sort of thing. And the example of that right now in the time period I'm talking about is 1931's The Viking. That's the state of the industry until the National Film Board of Canada gets established in 1939. It would establish that Canadian Government Motion Picture Bureau in 1940. And it was created and then led by a commissioner named John Grierson, who really helped establish the NFB to be the source for Canadian newsreels, docudramas, and at this time, because it's wartime, any fiction would be focused on war film, so propaganda.
I don't know if Americans know the NFB as well now as they used to. I know that like for a long time, NFB like docs or educational shorts or animated shorts would get like sent down to be shown in schools in certain parts of the US and stuff. But like the NFB, if you want to imagine what it is or was at the time Sarah's talking about, it's really like a government run movie studio.
Basically, yeah. Deciding who gets funding. Gerson was like, I think stability will hinder creativity. So people would only work on 3-month contracts. So these people would come on as like a director, a cinematographer, a grip, editor, whatever, for 3-month contracts and work on whatever was given to them. People would come to the board with a pitch and you could possibly get funding, you could possibly not. Very quickly, so in like 1941, like the following year, Grierson brought on Norman McLaren, who was an animator, and he established like the following year, like an animator unit. And ultimately there would be like 4 to 5-ish. The number kind of changes through the years, but 4 to 5 units. One with a focus on animation, one focused on like newsreels and news coverage, docudramas, quote unquote interpretive, which I think is how they mean to say experimental, stuff that would be focused on agriculture and other industries, travel and tourism, and then as well kind of splitting up English and French productions. And I think the absence of a feature-length fiction unit can kind of be summed up by the fact that Grierson invented the word for documentary as like the way to describe this one Canadian director, Robert Flaherty. He's most famous for 1922's Nanook of the North, one of our very first documentaries. So Grierson coined that term, and he believed that Canada is not large enough to support a market for independent feature film.
Yeah, and there's like a logic to this where if you've got Hollywood pumping out like high quality, extremely popular English language drama films, and you want to have a Canadian industry that you are supporting, it makes a certain kind of sense to go after the genres they're not doing. So, you know, documentary, obviously newsreels because our news is different, experimental, a lot of experimental stuff, animation, like Canada and the NFB, you know, have such a great history of animation up to and including today.
Absolutely. Now, that news coverage would end up seeing some critique and some censorship because some of the stories that would be covered, like there was one covering the Balkans, and that was criticized as being against the actions of the British in the Balkans. So a lot of these productions were seen as too left or having communist sympathizing, which again, this is like the 50s. So the influence of McCarthyism is definitely here. So that would lead to these broad productions and production units becoming centralized under one commissioner. The late 50s also saw tension for English and French productions. In one year, there was like 70 English productions and 4 French, as well as tension between the National Film Board of Canada and the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, the CBC, because the CBC wanted to have exclusivity over television, whereas NFB, seeing the trend of the film industry struggling with TV, also wanted in. Ultimately, CBC would get television production. The 50s would see the NFB become the leading producer of Canadian documentary, animation, and experimental film. For example, like Norman McLaren's unit put out 1952's Neighbours, which would win an Academy Award. So they are producing material that is globally recognized, but again, staying in their lane. The first NFB only produced, so NFB only funded, feature-length fiction film was Drylanders in 1963. So not even this movie. And even Drylanders is more of a documentary drama than a fiction movie. So, listener, you might be asking, why no feature-length fiction? Like, we've kind of talked about how Canada wants to stay in its lane, but like, even if it's privately funded, like, where are these creatives going? It's not like Canada doesn't produce creatives. Well, ultimately, those folks would leave for Hollywood or Britain, where they could actually get funding and recognition. Sidney Furie is one such example. We've already seen 2 movies from him, Dr. Blood's Coffin and The Snake Woman. He had directed, written, and produced 2 movies in Canada, 1957's A Dangerous Age and 1959's A Cool Sound from Hell, meant to capitalize on the teen trend. Ultimately, Furie would leave for Britain. He has this almost like heartbreaking quote that he gave to a member of the press in Britain. Quote, "I wanted to start a Canadian film industry, but nobody cared."
Mm-hmm.
Now, The Mask is 1961. The 1960s onward does see a turning point for Canadian feature fiction films for a few reasons. I'm not going to go into detail, but in the 1960s, Quebec, which is our province that is primarily French-speaking, they have a time in history called the Quiet Revolution, which is basically folks there deciding we want to prioritize us being considered French rather than being forced to assimilate into English culture or being English subjects.
Mm-hmm.
So the Quiet Revolution has many elements to it, but in the arts, we see it focusing on French language and showing rural Quebec in all its glory. Now, using some of the new technologies like lighter cameras in Quebec, we would see the development of this style, not subgenre, style of that's called direct cinema, which is basically cinema verite. In the UK, it's also called free cinema. So these are movements that are very focused on like a documentary style that is showing something as it happens with no filter through the director. They're just trying to show you as it happens.
Yeah, fly on the wall kind of.
Exactly. That cinema verite style, you see it in France, and I want to say it's in a movie in 1960, but in Quebec, it's in, the earliest example is in 1958's Les Vacatures by co-directors Michel Brault and Gilles Groux, which are showing this convention of rural Quebec snowshoers, which is cool.
Fun.
But that connection or similar movement to cinema verite meant that Quebec's film industry saw a lot of popularity in France with the French New Wave. Also with these lighter, cheaper cameras, we see a big boom of student-led films in Canada, but we also see that in the US with like a lot of movies to come in the late 60s. Like you think of like Easy Rider, for example. So a lot of that democratizing of film equipment and ability sees a worldwide boom. But we see it in Canada and like towards the later end of the 60s. At the time that The Mask is coming out in 1961, Canada is known for basically documentary or animation.
Yeah.
Those are the two main things, which I think is like, yes, those are our main artistic exports when it comes to film, but experimental is still in there. They tend to be experimental shorts.
And experimental animation.
But that's still in there. So when you hear of a movie that is like, oh, it's in 3D, and all of the posters for this movie call it like surrealist, I can kind of see how it's tapping into what is going on in the industry. It's not a complete outlier, but it definitely is in the sense of it being fiction and horror.
Yeah. Like, you know, the whole like direct cinema verite thing, like you have this tradition that starts with this heavy documentary focus. Then you get this direct cinema movement that's meant to be, as you said, like documentaries with no filter. And then that as a style like starts to inform dramatic pictures, which gets you to cinema verite. It's funny that you said they're kind of the same, because I know that the direct cinema directors hated cinema verite.
And the purposes of like a 20 to 30-minute summary of the Canadian film industry history, it's the same.
No, totally. It's like, you know, different factions on the left in politics, right? Where it's like
Marxists versus Leninists.
Yeah. It's like, you guys are the same fucking thing. But they definitely hated each other. But, you know, the other thing with these Quebec films, and, you know, this remained true of the industry from the late 60s to relatively recently, Quebec French language films became a huge part of the industry because they didn't have that same cultural overlap problem that English speaking Canada did, where like Hollywood English films played fine in English speaking Canada, but Quebec had enough of its own culture, you know, that it could really develop its own thing. But regardless, like even in our dramas of this period, the focus is on making them like as realistic and down to earth as possible. So horror is very different. What's really interesting to me is that ultimately horror becomes a big ongoing segment of what Canada does in its film industry, such that, like, gosh, I wish I could remember the name of it. There's a documentary about the Canadian film industry that I watched in film school that's called something along the lines of, like, you know, horror, sex, and weirdos, or something like that. It's trying to sum up what Canadian movies are like. And it's it's documentaries, animation, weird sex movies, and horror. Like, those are the genres, right? With The Mask, there are a couple of trivia points that are frequently said about this movie that I was not able to, like, independently verify. So I want to give them, like, big asterisks. Yeah. So we already talked about the idea that this is the first Canadian horror film, asterisk. We know about the werewolf. The other thing I see a lot is that this is the first Canadian film to receive wide distribution outside Canada. But as Sarah mentioned, Neighbours by Norman McLaren won an Oscar. And in fact, Canadian animated shorts win the Academy Award for Best Animated Short semi-regularly. So I think it would be more accurate to probably say that this is the first Canadian feature-length fiction film to get wide distribution outside Canada. Mm-hmm. And even that, I don't know that's true for sure, but that's probably closer to true. The other thing I see said a lot is that this is the only Canadian movie made in 3D. And again, I suspect that might be closer to true if we limit that to fiction, like feature-length fiction films.
Yeah.
And don't include experimental stuff or shorts. But even then, I'm, like, not sure. So I guess what I'm saying is that whenever you hear terms like first or only in regards to movies, it's probably a good idea to, like, hedge your bets, right?
Yeah. So
The Mask is directed by Julian Roffman, who was born in 1915 in Montreal, Quebec. But he's I believe, an Anglophone Canadian.
Context, Montreal's kind of a unique half and half. If you want to go to a city in Quebec that you're not going to be worrying about, will they be rude to me if I'm only speaking English? Because, you know, there are some places in Quebec where they will just not speak English to you. Montreal is your best bet.
Also, like, before the Quiet Revolution, as Sarah spoke about, there was certainly, like, a strong, like, English language, like, I want to say elite class, like of, like, business and politicians and stuff. It was very different pre 1960 to, like, now, where there are very, like, almost maybe too strict laws about, like, enforcing French speaking.
Anyways, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's thank you. So like a lot of other early Canadian filmmakers, Roffman produced a mixture of newsreel, documentary, propaganda content for the NFB during the Second World War. He also directed American newsreels for the March of Time. And in 1959, he directed a movie called The Bloody Brood, a crime thriller feature about the dangers of beatniks, starring Peter Falk, which it took Roffman 5 years to raise the money for. He formed a company in 1954, and he was like, I'm going to make feature-length fiction films with this company, and they didn't get one made until 1959. And so it took him 5 years to get the money. The budget for The Bloody Brood was $90,000.
Oh.
It took him 5 years to raise $90,000 to make a Canadian feature-length fiction film.
So that's also $90,000 Canadian dollars.
Yeah, in 1959.
Yeah, but like...
I don't know what the exchange rate back then was. The dollar's usually weak compared to the American dollar. But regardless, ultimately, how he was able to secure that funding was with the aid of producer Nat Taylor. Nat Taylor was a Jewish Canadian born in Toronto in 1906, and he was very business-minded. At age 17, he was employed as a theater manager while earning his law degree. By 1934, he had gone into business for himself, owning a chain of theaters called Twin X, which stood for 20th Century Theaters, which had 17 locations by 1941.
Okay.
So talking about like breaking that Famous Players monopoly that you were talking about earlier. Now, not for very long, Twin X became the Canadian branch of Famous Players Theaters in order to prevent Twin X from merging with another rising Canadian theater chain that was starting to challenge Famous Players, which was the Odeon theater chain.
Yeah.
That was Famous Players Canada's biggest competition. So Famous Players Canada came in and basically said to Taylor, like, do you want to run Famous Players Canada and we'll take on all your Twin X theaters and, you know, you'll be the Canadian arm of this. And Taylor said yes. And he began like innovating. In 1947, Taylor opened what is, you know, supposedly the first multi-screen movie theater, or Cineplex as we call them, in Ottawa at the Elgin Theatre, selling tickets for different movies from the same box office, which no one had done before. You know, you went into one box office, bought your tickets, and there was a Theater 1 and a Theater 2. He also created one of the first theaters in a shopping mall and one of the first theaters in an office building. Both of those were also in Ontario in the 1960s. By the 1970s, he had sold most of his locations outright to Famous Players. So basically let them buy him out of all of his locations and deals, and he was out of the Famous Players game. And yet, rather than just get out of the game completely, he started a new exhibition company in 1979 with Garth Drabinsky called Cineplex. And in 1984, Cineplex purchased Odeon, becoming Cineplex Odeon. And so you had two major chains in Canada, Famous Players and Cineplex Odeon. And then in 2005, Cineplex Odeon purchased Famous Players. And so today, Cineplex is the largest theater chain in Canada, accounting for 75% of the Canadian box office.
Yep, it's Cineplex or Landmark.
Yeah. Taylor passed away in 2004, so unfortunately he
he didn't get to see his Monopoly dreams?
Yeah, he did not live to see his company take back all of those Famous Players locations.
Maybe it was his dying wish.
Yeah, no kidding. But still, that's who Nat Taylor is. He basically is responsible for 75% of the Canadian exhibition industry.
Wild.
So he came in with his money to co-produce The Bloody Brood. And that's how Roffman got his money. Now, The Bloody Brood was shot by Roffman in 16 days and released in 1959 by Allied artists. This movie, the National Legion of Decency, which was the Catholics, condemned it as morally objectionable. It had to be edited in order to play in America and get code approval, and it was banned altogether in Alberta.
Whoa, whoa, whoa. Go Alberta.
They appealed they appealed the decision, and the ban was upheld on appeal.
Hilarious. Alberta is, Alberta and Ontario are kind of the conservative places in Canada.
Like right now, sure. I don't know as like Ontario has always been super conservative.
I mean, in terms of values.
Yeah. I get what you're saying.
Okay.
I'm just pushing back on that lightly because those things have changed over time, except for Alberta. Definitely, Alberta's like the... If you took Montana and Texas and mushed them together and then put them where it's cold, that's Alberta.
Well, that's what Montana's bringing. The cold.
Right.
Anyways, okay.
The point is that after The Bloody Brood's financially unsuccessful release, Roffman and Taylor were approached by New York advertisers Frank Tobbs and Sandy Haber with an idea for a horror film in 2D with select 3D sequences. I don't know why these New York advertisers in 1959 thought that was like a good idea. The 3D craze had been over for like 5 years at that point, but that was the idea they came to them with. Now, why did Roffman and Taylor agree to such a thing? Well, Roffman was friends with Raymond Spottiswoode, and Raymond Spottiswoode was a British film theoretician.
theoretician.
He specialized in like developing new ways to make movies.
Okay.
And he worked for the NFB. And years earlier, he had developed a 3D system called the Depth Dimension for the UK National Research Council, which had been experimented with 10 years earlier during the first 3D boom to make a bunch of shorts, but hadn't really been used since. So the thing to remember about 3D, because it's been a long time since we talked about 3D movies, is all of these 3D methods were kind of like proprietary, right? And controlled by certain companies who controlled the cameras. And so to make a 3D movie, you need kind of access to that kind of thing, or you had to figure out your own way of doing it. So because Roffman was friends with Raymond Spottiswoode, he got Spottiswoode to agree to let them use the depth dimension. And so the NRC rented the cameras to Roffman and Taylor for £4,000 a week.
Is that a lot?
I feel
like were they getting scammed?
So yes and no. It's so hard to do the conversion of like pounds to Canadian dollars, 1960 to 2025. But like that feels like a lot to me. But then also like you're renting 3D cameras. So like I get it, you know? It's expensive, but like it's reasonable. They got access to these cameras. One thing I'm really excited about is, you know, when Avatar came out in 2009 and it set off the second 3D boom, and everybody was like, oh, you know what's great about Avatar's 3D is instead of stuff like coming out of the screen at you, you have like depth and you see into the movie. That's what like the depth dimension system was supposed to be trying to do. And I've heard that like the 3D in this movie is like really technically proficient. So I'm interested a lot in that. As a side note, Raymond Spottiswoode had a son, Roger Spottiswoode, who also became a filmmaker and went on to direct 1997's Tomorrow Never Dies, starring Pierce Brosnan as James Bond.
Nice.
Yeah. So the team brought on like an experienced group of technicians to handle the 2D and 3D cinematography. Herb Alpert was the cinematographer. They brought on a 3D specialist who had worked at 20th Century Fox. They brought on like a team of special effects guys. And Roffman's creative inspiration for this movie was seeing an exhibit at a museum on Aztec masks. He was like, that's cool. So they brought on like a large number of writers, not all at the same time, but like they kept hiring writers to come in and write screenplays and then not being happy and then hiring new writers to come in and rewrite.
This is famously a good sign.
Yes. But the idea throughout was that the 3D sequences in the movie would be surrealist dream sequences that the main character has when he puts on the mask.
Okay.
And the mask itself is like this, I don't know if it's Aztec in the movie, but it's like this tribal mask that has sort of a magic hold on the lead character.
Sure.
You know, like Jim Carrey's The Mask, but totally different.
But legally distinct.
Right.
I do think like tapping into that surrealist vibe that we're seeing with like Roger Corman's stuff, for example, I think is smart.
Mm-hmm. The 3D dream sequences were designed by Slavko Vorkapic, a Serbian film artist who co-created the famous surrealist silent short The Life and Death of 9413, a Hollywood extra, which he co-directed with Murders in the Rue Morgue director Robert Florey in 1928. Vorkapic designed special montages and dream sequences for a variety of Hollywood films, to such an extent that in Golden Age Hollywood, montage sequences were referred to as Vorkapiches, including the extremely Freudian dream sequences in the 1941 Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
Okay.
He served as chair of the film department at University of Southern California, but ultimately his ideas for the dream sequences for this movie were too expensive. They were things like, you know, having like armies of rats and anyways. So instead, the sequences were actually developed by the film's storyboard artist, Hugo Wutrick, and the film's cinematographer, Herb Alpert, and also the effects men who were hired in a collaborative process. Nevertheless, Vorkapic was still credited for developing the sequences due to the terms of his contract.
Well, also there's a bit of name brand there.
Oh, absolutely. The Mask stars Paul Stevens, an American character actor from Los Angeles, who is probably best remembered for his role as like one of Patton's aides in the 1970 film Patton. And his leading lady is another American, actress Claudette Nevins, who had a long career guest starring in television. So we get some American actors in.
So here's the thing. Grierson, when he started the NFB, was feature fiction film requires so much collaboration and cross-cultural promotion that it doesn't make sense for us to fund a solely Canadian outlet for that. And I think this is a good example of like what he's talking about.
In like modern day Canadian film, you get like tax subsidies or grants if your movie is Canadian, and what makes it count as Canadian is like a certain threshold of people working on it as Canadian. So like typically you want your below the line people to all be Canadian.
Can you define what that is for our folks?
So below the line people on a film are generally, the easiest way I think to explain it to a lay person is all the people who only get credited in the end credits of a movie. And your above the line people are your department heads, your stars, that kind of stuff. And there's a certain percentage of those who need to be Canadian. You can't if you just bring in an entirely American crew of department heads and star actors, then it's not like really a Canadian film for tax purposes, but there's like a percentage there and you can like negotiate those things. So absolutely, this is a long tradition, but I just wanted to point out that like our star actors here are Americans, but I think it makes sense that they are minor American character actors and TV guest stars who are coming to star in this Canadian movie.
Yes.
Right. But even like that's how messed up this is like an American character actor is better for a Canadian film than a Canadian star.
Yeah, a homegrown star.
Right.
Yeah.
So The Mask was shot over the course of 10 weeks in Toronto.
Oh, that's long.
It is worth noting that 8 of those weeks were for the film's 14 minutes worth of 3D scenes, which were shot first because they were like, let's make sure we get all the 3D stuff right, and then we can kind of whatever on the 2D stuff.
So 8 weeks times £4,000 a week. That's a lot of money.
Yeah, exactly. So 8 weeks for the 3D stuff, 2 weeks for the rest of the movie.
Yeah.
The film ultimately cost close to $300,000, which is frankly kind of a fortune for a Canadian feature film. Remember I said Bloody Brood was $90,000.
Yeah. Also, we've been seeing stuff from Corman for the longest time that is like 200,000. So it's like this feels in the realm of what we've been seeing.
Yeah, exactly. Corman's budgets have certainly recently gone up to like $1 million, but like
he started in the 200K, and like ballparking 200K American is about 300K Canadian. So
maybe now, again, I have no idea what the conversion was at the time, but the film was shot in black and white because, it was already easier, less expensive, right? But the 3D sections were printed on color film stock, but were still shot in black and white. Sarah, can you guess why that is?
Oh, because this is the 3D that has like the red and the blue floaty bits.
Yeah. Yes. So this picture,
the technical terms.
Yeah. This picture uses an anaglyph 3D method, which is the type of 3D where the left and right eye images are dyed red and cyan, respectively. This enables the two images to be printed together into one film strip and then projected by one projector, with red and cyan glasses being used to decode the image to produce the stereoscopic effect, rather than the much more expensive method of two projectors at the same time and wearing polarized lenses to create the stereoscopic effect, which is how 3D film was actually done in the 3D boom of the 1950s and 2010s. So that classic red and blue paper, plastic, glasses 3D movie image doesn't really belong to like the two eras of 3D supremacy at the movie theater, but it was perfect for movies like this that came out outside of those periods because theaters didn't have to like retrofit an expensive second projector into them, right? Like it's 1961. The 3D boom ended in 1954 or so. Like no theaters wanted to like retrofit everything for one fucking Canadian movie, right? So Anaglyph 3D has this advantage of you can just have a red and a cyan black and white film printed onto red and cyan dyed stock that you then project onto one projector, and you wear these glasses and it creates the effect.
So it's about 7 years from the boom in the 50s. So I wonder if that almost gave this a little bit of a nostalgia vibe.
Nostalgia or novelty, like either you hadn't seen a 3D movie in a while or you'd never seen a 3D movie yet, right? Now, the disadvantage of Anaglyph 3D is that colors obviously become difficult to render accurately if you have to like dye red and green, basically. But in a black and white film, that matters a lot less. Taylor received distribution rights offers from Paramount and Warner Brothers for this film. And although Paramount's offer was higher at $350,000, Taylor went with Warner Brothers because according to him, they just seemed like nicer people.
Well, I wonder if he knew about like the vertical integration with Famous Players and was like, nah.
I mean, by this point that had been like broken, but maybe that's why he didn't want to deal with them, is he had that history of dealing with them. I don't know. Paramount liked this movie, though, so much that they offered Roffman a contract to make more horror pictures.
Oh.
But he declined because he wanted to make serious films.
Boo. Horror can be serious.
It's also probably a mistake. Like, take the job.
Yeah.
Always take the job. In terms of Roffman and what he did after this, he produced a movie about draft dodgers coming up to Canada during the Vietnam War called Explosion in 1969. Nice. And he wrote and produced a bizarre cult action movie called The Glove in 1979. And in 1987 to 88, he wrote a series of romance TV movies called Shades of Love. And he passed away at 84 years old in 2000.
He should have taken the job, I think.
That is also what I think. The Mask's score is by Canadian composer Louis Applebaum.
Applebaum jeans. Sorry.
Born in 1918 in Toronto, Applebaum composed approximately 250 film scores for the NFB from 1942 to 1960. He was nominated for an Academy Award in 1945. He won a Canadian Film Award, a Gemini Award, and he wrote the fanfare played before every performance at the main stage of the Stratford Shakespeare Festival since 1953.
Dang.
He also passed away in 2000 at age 82. The trailer for The Mask that was used to promote this film includes a long explanation of like the symbolism of masks from noted mask collector Jim Moran. Born in 1908, Moran was in fact a publicist, specifically the master of the publicity stunt.
The masketer?
Right. He first made a name for himself when he went to Alaska to sell a refrigerator to an Inuit on behalf of General Electric. Other publicity stunts included changing horses midstream in the Nevada River during a presidential election, walking a bull through a New York china shop, spending 2 days looking for a needle in a haystack to promote real estate deals, etc., etc.
Okay, Mr. Marketer.
Yeah, this is, this is viral marketing stunts before the internet, right? The film premiered in New York, on October 27th, 1961.
Ooh, right in time for Halloween.
Right. Specially made anaglyph 3D glasses were given to audience members that had like a unique design called the Magic Mystic Masks with green and red filters, so that when the lead character puts on his mask, you put on your mask, and then you see the 3D sequences.
Oh, that's fun.
The film actually did quite well for itself. It earned $1.5 million during its initial release.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, although Warner Brothers' distribution contract prevented the Canadian filmmakers from receiving a percentage on any of the film's box office earned in America. So much for them being nicer people.
Yeah.
After the Warner Brothers distribution deal lapsed, New Line Cinema distributed the film in the 1970s using the name Eyes of Hell.
Oh, that's a good name too.
And then in the 80s, it played on TV under the name The Spooky Movie Show.
That's not as good of a name. Is there any relation to The Mask with Jim Carrey?
Absolutely none.
Anything about like, oh, they maybe saw this on like late night TV and so had the idea of like a mask that turns someone into something else? Like,
I don't think so. There's like maybe, but The Mask starring Jim Carrey is actually based on a really violent sort of edgelord black comedy comic book series from Dark Horse Comics in the 90s that like is sort of like super satirical and also like, yeah, just like very dark and violent, but also still has that like Looney Tunes violence stuff. And I don't know is where the creators of the original comic, like John Arcudi and Doug Monkey, I think are the people. I don't know where their inspiration came from. So like maybe they saw this movie on late night TV or something, but I know that the Jim Carrey movie is based on this comic book, which I've read and is very, listen, you can see how they got from A to B with the comic to the movie, but it's also sort of like Men in Black is based on like a really dark indie comic that has very little to do with them. Anyways, it's fine. We're not talking about The Mask. Well, we are.
But I mean, I've always found like the Jim Carrey mask and this idea of like putting on a mask and becoming like something different has ties to Jekyll and Hyde.
Oh, sure.
As like a concept. So I think we're all just drinking from the same well here.
Yeah, absolutely. I also really liked the, I think The Haunted Mask was my favorite Goosebumps book.
I don't remember that one.
Oh. Anyways, the rights to The Mask lapsed, and the film has been issued on various poor home media releases over the years. But when the Toronto International Film Festival found that the only 35mm print that they had access to was too brittle to ever be screened again, they partnered with the 3D Archive in New Jersey and Technicolor Toronto to restore The Mask, debuting the restoration in 2015. This led to the movie's release on Blu-ray by Kino Lorber.
Oh, yeah.
And The Mask was also featured in Season 13, Episode 11 of Mystery Science Theater 3000 in 2022.
That's fairly recent.
Yeah, it's like one of the revival seasons.
Yeah. Well, I'm very excited to see this piece of Canadian history, really.
Absolutely, so am I.
How are we watching it?
We're going to be watching it on that Blu-ray from Kino Lorber, which, as I understand it, lets you watch it either in...
Normie versus 3D?
So there's a 3D mode that works if you have a 3D Blu-ray player and a 3D TV from 10 years ago. Or there's just a regular 2D mode. Or I believe there's also an anaglyph 3D mode that can work if you've got the blue and red glasses.
Oh, we do?
Yeah, so hopefully we'll be able to get that to work and experience some of the 3D charm here.
Awesome. Well, folks, hopefully you can find a copy to watch along. You're going to hear a brief musical interlude, and when we come back, we will discuss The Mask from 1961, directed by Julian Roffman.
See you on the other side, everybody. Welcome back to Scream Scene, everybody. We just finished watching The Mask in 3D. Sarah, what'd you think?
This movie is really cool. I highly recommend watching it if you can find it. I also appreciated sometimes when you hear about movies getting renamed later on, those titles don't really fit. One of the titles that this movie got later on was Eyes of Hell or Eyes Out of Hell or something.
Eyes of Hell, yeah.
I can definitely see where that came from in this. The spooky
movie show.
Yeah, that one, whatever. But yeah, I really enjoyed this. What did you think?
Yeah, I think my reaction is William Castle, eat your heart out.
Yeah.
Just hell yeah.
Yeah, I'm really disappointed the director turned down that movie deal.
Yeah. I really liked this, and I really admire what it's doing. I do have like some qualms, but overall, I think this is great.
Yeah, especially for like something that is a little bit out of left field. Yeah, let me tell the folks at home what it's about.
For sure.
And then we can dig in. One thing that has been bothering me. So you talked a little bit about this guy named Jim Moran, who's like this like marketer, but he's
publicity stunt guy.
Yeah, and he's playing a mask collector here. I was like, why is that name so familiar? And I think it's because my brain is thinking of that actor whose name is Dick Moran.
Yes.
You say that like they're related. Are they related?
No, not at all. I'm just saying that's probably why the name sounds familiar.
Okay, cool. I kind of only made that realization as we sat down to record. So Ben talked about Jim in the introduction, and he also introduces the movie for us. He explains, I'm a collector of these ancient masks, and we are going to be seeing a picture about this strange mask and the threads that are weaved of like a horrific time that lies before you. Then we get a very strong opening of a young man with an expressionless face stalking and chasing a young woman through the woods. It's a very classic kind of chase scene. She's like yelling and screaming and crying and like running in the woods, but also like slowly and like looking behind her as she runs. It's very like stereotypical horror picture, and particularly of the slasher genre we get later on. So seeing it in 1961 is pretty cool. The man catches up to her and strangles her to death, but she does leave 3 scratches on his face. We learn that this man is Michael Radin, and he goes to see his psychiatrist, Dr. Alan Barnes. He explains he is in a, quote, walking nightmare, and it all seems tied to this mask that he is obsessed with. Now, Barnes is not sure what to make of all this. He's been seeing Radin for a while, and he's like, no, I'm pretty sure there's something in your own subconscious that you're just externalizing onto this mask. Radin goes home, and we see that he packages up the mask and sends it in the mail to Dr. Barnes, and then he kills himself. Then we get to meet Police Lieutenant Martin, who is investigating this suicide as well as the homicides of the women that have been killed. And he learns about the mask. So Radin had been working at the Museum of Ancient History and had taken home some artifacts for some further study, including the mask. Now, this mask was from a dig in the Indies, and there were, like, when they had been doing the digging, they had found, like, it must have been tied to some kind of, like, ritual about finding the evil within man and bringing that to the surface. Now, the reason this is important to the lieutenant is because it's missing from the crime scene.
At one point in the movie, they say that the dig site was near Tikal, which means that the mask is implied to be Mayan.
I must have misheard the Indies then.
Yeah, I think he said the Andes, which is the South American mountain range.
Sure.
Yeah.
The sound in this movie wasn't the best.
It It was good and bad, which I'm going to talk about later.
Yeah.
But the dialogue recording was a little weak.
Yeah. So Barnes gets this package. Inside it is also the suicide note saying, like, Dr. Barnes, like, you didn't believe me, so here's the mask you can see for yourself. And Barnes is seeking to understand his patient, so he does indeed put on the mask. And this is when we get the first of, I believe, 3 surrealist nightmare logic imagery. I'm not really going to go into the imagery in detail, because it does a really good job of following that nightmare logic that, like, it makes sense when you're seeing it, but if I were to try to list out what happens, it would be like, and then, and then,
Yeah.
and then. So I don't think it's particularly helpful. But like a lot of nightmares, we do see people in the dreams that are in his real life.
One of the things that I think was interesting about these dream sequences overall is everyone in them is more or less wearing a mask, including Barnes himself, who I am pretty sure is played by a different actor in these dream sequences. There's this like masked version of Barnes with a different haircut who like meets up with Barnes at the start of the first dream sequence, and there's like voiceover that's like, I'm Barnes. And then that guy goes off and has adventures. And the reason I'm pretty sure it's 2 different actors is there's a credit at the start of the movie for a mime.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, the guy in the dream sequences is definitely got a lot of like miming experience because it's all silent acting.
Yeah, and also the mask that he has on his face, as well as like many of the like the female figure we see in the nightmare, they have almost like a eyes without a face type mask.
Yeah.
But the mouth is fully covered.
Yeah. And so you get like a lot of death imagery.
Yeah. He takes off the mask and is completely hooked. Like, he has grown stubble in the brief experience he had. We don't get a sense of time, but his fiance comes back after going shopping and finds him like on the floor, kind of sweating and like a little jittery. And he tells his fiance, whose name is Pam, that this mask has uncovered some sort of secret of the human mind. And what a gift to psychiatry if I can do some further study with it. And she's like, this seems not safe. And he's like, no, it's perfectly safe. Let me do what I want.
One of the like interesting things about this movie is there's, and we can talk about this a little more later, but there's this like continuing ambiguity between the psychological and the like mystical. Like all of the nightmare visions have like images of death and images of masks and images of people, but also kind of like images of ancient societies and like sacrificial altars and things like this.
And the altar alternates between like the stone slab and then also the bed thing that his patients lay down
couch,
on.
yeah.
Well, I wouldn't really call it a couch, but anyways.
I think it's colloquially called a couch.
Okay.
But yes, absolutely. And so it's like, it's ambiguous how much of this imagery is coming from Barnes's like subconscious and his ideas about the mask, which seem to be what like he thinks it is, because he thinks it's this great psychiatric tool. And how much is like mystical, like ancient visions magically coming from the mask. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And even then, it's not necessarily coming from the mask, but revealing something about the human mind.
Mm-hmm.
So while Lieutenant Martin continues to investigate where the mask is, Pam worries about Barnes. She even goes so far as to try to get the mask, like she steals the mask from him and tries to get it back to the museum, but Barnes goes in and steals it back. And then because he's been using the mask and kind of secluding himself from his life, the police are also like, why has Barnes disappeared? Everything seems a little fishy. Now, we've kind of described his belief around the mask as being, you know, it reveals something about the inner mind. But a lot of the way that the ancient curse is kind of discussed is it brings the evil out in men. And it almost like removes your inhibitions. And yeah, they describe it as like, oh, you're becoming evil or something like that. In the case of Barnes, it leads him to sleep with his secretary and goes so far to even be tempted to strangle her.
It's like that episode of Star Trek.
There are so many, my guy.
Where Kirk gets split into good and evil. And like the evil Kirk has all of like the like base animal, you know, instincts or drives or urges or whatever. It's the, you know what I mean?
So yes, but the point of that episode is that it's not wholly evil.
Yes.
Right?
The point of that episode that they get to is that like
the confidence of Kirk.
Yeah.
Whereas I don't think that's what this movie is trying to do. So
No.
I feel like this is not exactly something to bring up.
Okay.
I'm sorry to shut down a comparison here.
I just mean that like what's the same in both is that like the mask is not turning Barnes into someone he's not. It's like amplifying. The idea is that it's amplifying a part of him that's always there.
Yes.
And that like it's normal that that part is there. Like at one point when they're talking about like the evil in men, you know, it's like, yeah, all people have that or whatever.
So realizing that there's a danger in the mask, Barnes ends up going to his old professor and mentor, Professor Quincy, who reluctantly agrees to monitor Barnes using the mask. At first, he's like totally against him continuing to use the mask, but essentially he agrees for his house to be a safe consumption site.
Mm-hmm.
Despite this, Barnes can't stop putting on the mask even outside of this house. Like he's like, no, I can't wait. I need to do it now. And he goes so far as to even start threatening Pam. Pam manages to convince Barnes to go to Professor Quincy, but after a particularly bad mask nightmare, Barnes leaves and ends up driving to his secretary. Now, he goes out with her and then kills, her. He goes to strangle her, saying that he needs to take a life to no man's mind, but maybe gets away. We see her like leave the car in like as like running, but it's unclear. Now, because he was off driving under the influence, Pam and Quincy call the police, but Barnes returns before the police can arrive, and he ends up killing Quincy and then confronts Pam. Basically goes to force her to wear the mask to no effect. She's like, I'm just wearing the mask. I can see you through the eye holes. And he's like, you're lying. It enrages Barnes and he starts to strangle her. And that's when Lieutenant Martin comes in and he knocks Barnes out. Then in the final scene, we see the mask on open display in the museum being talked about and then tempting a museum patron to put on the mask, thereby implying that like only some people feel the effects. So it must be something inside people. But that's the end.
If I were to start with like the first thing I really love about this movie, I love the visuals.
Yes, I think it's very strong.
This film is shot so well.
It adds a lot of like visual interest and depth through lighting, even in the parts that weren't in the nightmare sequence. Like you said that they shot for like 8 weeks.
8 weeks for the 3D stuff and 2 weeks for the normal stuff.
Yeah, so 2 weeks, that's not a lot of time. And they clearly took a lot of care, both with like the lighting and then a very active camera. Yeah,
from the first scene, you can tell that the cinematographer, Herb Alpert, no relation to Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass, has a really good understanding of like light and shadow, chiaroscuro, black and white imagery, and also like lighting for drama rather than realism.
Yes.
Like that first scene in the woods, they've got like a generator out there with some lights and some like rain machines and fog so that there's plenty of like visual interest throughout that whole sequence. In a lot of the dialogue scenes, like he's got like, I'm just going to call them like drama lights that are like pointed at certain places so that like when this character says their lines, they step forward to a mark and they step into like a light that's shining like right across their eyes while the rest of them is in shadow, that kind of stuff.
So there's another Star Trek connection.
Sure. The camera's always moving. The framing is always creative, right? And that's just the 2D stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
It looks really good. And then the 3D stuff is some of the coolest imagery we've seen in a horror movie so far.
Yes, it's been a long time since we've had something this creativity pushing. You know what I mean? Like pushing the boundaries of like what someone is willing to put effort into.
Yeah, this creative, this innovative. It's like Jigoku-esque is how I would describe a lot of these sequences. You already said like the nightmare logic is on point.
Because as you're watching it, you're like, yeah, you're following along. It doesn't feel like a bunch of spaghetti thrown at the wall that doesn't seem to make sense.
It's really like excellent montage, just visions of horror that are filled with like symbolism and like pseudo anthropological significance. One thing that's always like been a real interest of mine since university is kind of like looking at ancient texts, so like Gilgamesh kind of stuff, through the lens of like Jungian kind of like philosophy or psychology, in the sense of like looking at mythology and identifying these like key symbolic archetypes that like speak to like the inner nature of people, right? Mm-hmm. These like archetypes that really always hit home regardless of like what philosophy or mythology they show up in. And a lot of those sort of vibes come out through this, where they're mixing like this ancient civilization imagery with the like death sort of nightmare imagery. I just really loved like all of the trippy surrealist visuals, which combine like crumbling ruins and masks and images of death and fog and water and like classic 3D movie coming right at you kind of gags.
But they also did that depth thing you talked about. Like there were many times where the stuff that was in the foreground was designed so it felt like it was pulling you in. So you were falling into the nightmare at the same time, which was very cool.
This is where I do have to bring up something about the home video release of this from Kino, because it annoyed me and I want to make sure other people know about it.
Oh, okay.
So on the Blu-ray of The Mask, they've got like a 3D mode for you to watch the movie in 3D, which is meant for like 3D Blu-ray players and 3D TVs. So if you have some of those from like 10 years ago, you can watch it that way. Otherwise, you watch it in 2D. The 3D that works with like a TV is a kind of like flickering, alternating frame thing, and you have to like have these special glasses that are like keyed to the frame rate of the TV and all this stuff. But in theaters, this was done, as we discussed in the intro, in anaglyph 3D, right? Because that was easier. On the Blu-ray, you can see the 3D sequences in anaglyph 3D as a bonus feature separately. If you're just watching the whole movie, it's either 3D or 2D, and the 3D has to be like with a 3D TV and stuff.
I feel like that should be opposite.
Right. On the DVD disc, you can watch the whole movie through with the anaglyph 3D sequences inside. And this is really annoying to me because the Blu-ray disc still has the anaglyph 3D sequences on it, just as like a separate bonus feature. And it would not take any effort in authoring the disc to make it seamlessly branch so that you could watch it, the 2D version with either the anaglyph sequences or not. So that really bothers me, because the only way you can see this movie the way it was seen in a theater is on the DVD copy. Now, luckily, like the restoration is really good, so it does look good either way, but it's just an annoyance, and it's an annoyance that I want people to like know about, because the packaging that describes what's on the discs is like a little confusing, a little misleading. So,
well, if we want to complain a little bit about the release, I do want to say they give you one mask.
Right.
So luckily we had another pair of the red blue glasses for you to wear. And the mask is sized for a child. It is a little small.
Yeah.
Luckily I have a small face, but if we want to like nitpick a little bit there.
Sure. There was also something else that the Kino release did that was really cool that I was not sure if you would notice, because you tend to be sensitive to sound stuff. But the movie is in like mono sound like you'd expect from a movie of this vintage until the 3D sequences. And then it's in 5.1 surround.
Yeah, I did notice.
Cool. Yeah, I just thought that was a really cool way of like using the sound to create a 3D effect as well at the same time.
Yeah, the immersive effect.
Exactly.
Would that have happened in theaters?
Oh, no, you would have had to have specially set up theaters for that.
Yeah.
So it's
probably more just something with the restoration.
Yeah, it's something that they did to be cool. There are so many like visual effects as well in the 3D sequences that even without doing those scenes in 3D, they would have been super time consuming and difficult to achieve in 1961. Like it's a lot of stuff that we take for granted today, like compositing and cross dissolves and animation and things. But like for a Canadian movie in 1961, like this stuff is hard to pull off, and to pull off as well as they do. Like they've got everything lined up for the cross dissolves like perfectly.
They do a really good job. They do really awesome special effects. There are these like dinky little snake puppets that come out, but I love them.
I think they work all right with like the black and white and the 3D kind of like obscuring them. I don't think they would have worked as well as like if it was brightly lit and in color.
Yeah, I really enjoyed them. And like the whole sequences. That's kind of also why I don't want to go like line by line, because I want the listeners to be able to experience it without knowing too much about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think all of these like different effects, and there's like a lot of gore in the 3D sequences as well.
Yeah, that's fair. There's a lot of blood, a lot of like scratches, and a lot of like dismemberment, basically.
They will, like, if someone gets stabbed in one of these 3D sequences, they will show like the stabbing implement get lifted up and then show like blood dripping off of it, because the blood will drip in the 3D and look cool, right? But even still, it's like, I don't think we've ever seen anything like that before, really. And while some of the coming right at you stuff is maybe like a little bit hokey to the modern eye, like on a creative ambition level, this is just super cool.
I'm not going to hold it against a 3D movie for its coming right at you moments, you know? Like if fucking Wax Museum can have the ping pong coming right at you, which was totally divorced from the actual like plot of the movie and everything, I am going to give this movie a pass for having this stuff that's about the horror movie and the themes, etc., tied to it.
Yeah, I think the best horror imagery in the movie really is in the 3D sequences, which have a real daringness that I think the rest of the movie lacks a little.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Like, I think they're able to get away with how provocative the gore and the imagery is because it's a dream sequence. But unfortunately, it leads to a fairly bloodless rest of the movie. Case in point is the conclusion of whether the secretary is alive or dead. We don't know. The only person that we really see him kill on screen is Quincy, and even that is kind of the bloodless choking, and it's like he starts choking on screen and then it ends off screen. Mm-hmm. So it's fairly bloodless outside of those sequences.
I have to wonder if like some of that was some kind of censorship concession where it was like, if you have a choice of where to put the gore. Yeah. And the gory stuff in the 3D sequences took you 8 weeks to film and was like super costly and expensive. So if you have a choice, like it's like, okay, can we keep the 3D gore that was really expensive if we have there be like nothing really in the 2D scenes, right? It feels like a trade-off.
And there was another moment where it felt like the characters referred to a scene that we didn't see. There was a moment when Pam, before she convinces him to go to Quincy, she's like, so it was you, or something like that, where it was like, are you referring to something that I missed? Like that I looked away at the wrong time? So it felt like something else was missing. I think,
yeah, this is something I wanted to talk about because this is one of my few like problems with the movie. Like one of my problems is that the 2D scenes are a little tepid. Not tepid's not the right word.
Standard?
Sure. A lot of the violence is off screen or implied, or sometimes is like a fake out where you think some violent thing has happened and it hasn't really. And that comes to like what you're talking about. And that comes to my other minor problem with this movie, which is, so it has like really great visuals and some pretty cool action scenes, if you want to call them that. There's like a car chase.
Oh yeah, it was great.
But one thing I also noticed is the movie has a very modern editing style. We move from event to event very quickly without a need for like establishing shots or traveling shots. Like we don't have to see Barnes go from point A to point B. We can just cut from A to B. You know, and another really modern feeling thing is like characters speaking in one scene will have voiceover where their dialogue continues into the next scene, keeping the pace going and engaging. But I do think this style occasionally works against the movie when one scene cuts to another so abruptly that we aren't really sure what happened.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think it's a positive that it keeps up momentum and pace, but it does lead to a question of like, how long has it been?
Yeah.
Like, I think they say something like, you know, it's only been like 2 days since Raiden's suicide, yet it's like, yeah, but then you've seen your secretary twice, and one time, like in both times, it was like threatening. Like, why would she go out with you so quickly the next time? Like,
yeah, so this is the thing that confused me was like the first time he goes out with his secretary, he like seduces her at the office. There's a sort of edit that implies they had sex between scenes. He drives her out to like make out point and then goes to like choke her. And then it cuts away to other stuff. And I thought Barnes had killed his secretary until he showed up at her house later in the movie and was like, hey, do you want to drive to make out point with me again so I can try to choke you again? And I was like, oh, she's still alive. And I don't think that was meant to be like a dramatic irony thing where it's a reveal that she's still alive. It just was like a bit of a sloppy edit, I think.
Yeah. That being said, I think overall the acting is really well done in both the real and nightmarish worlds. I think everything felt very down to earth. Like no one felt like they were like overacting. The cop scenes, I had a hard time following because they used a lot of like, not necessarily jargon, but slang.
Lingo.
That I was like, what the fuck are they even saying? Like it was like hearing white people jive that I was from like 50 years ago that I was like, I don't know what you were saying, but you're just talking about donuts.
At one point you were like, what are they even saying? And I said, it's just 50s tough guy talk. Like it's fine. But I do agree. Like the 2D scenes have great visuals. They're very like film noir.
Yeah.
But I think what makes them work is the intensity of the performances, right? And that really pushes those scenes to the intensity that they need to be when the violence is kind of toned down for them. Everyone's really acting their heart out to a degree that we don't really tend to see in these kinds of movies. Like you either get the overacting or you get like the nothing at all.
Which would be Jim Moran.
Right, yes.
He needed more charisma. He needed, like, I was like, why are you talking about, like, I think the hope was that he would be like that mystic in front of Ed Wood's movie.
Yeah, like Criswell, but like, or, you know, just a horror host, right? He's,
but he was so bland.
Oh, yeah, it was the worst part of the movie. Luckily, it's over with very quickly at the start. But yeah, I suspect that one of the reasons why the performances here are so good is because the movie is very clear what its metaphor is about. And I think that gives the actors like a touchstone to hold on to.
Which is addiction. If my snide, I don't know if it was snide, my description of Quincy's house as a safe consumption site didn't give away. But literally that's how they are talking about it in like 1950s language, of course, but like, or I guess 60s, we're in 1961. But yeah, every way that they're talking about the use of the mask, it's very clear it's about addiction, to the point where when Pam convinces Barnes to go to Quincy's, they might as well have been talking about heroin.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's not even clever to point this out because they say it in dialogue.
Yes.
Right? Like she goes like, you know, he's talking to her about how desperately he needs the mask. And she's kind of egging him on being like, what does it feel like, Alan? Does it feel like a drug? Is it like an addiction? And then she goes on to like describe what like being addicted to drugs feels like, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of talk about the mask and how it doesn't turn you into someone you're not so much as it draws out what's already there. And, you know, you'd think that a movie like this would play with themes of identity or the idea that a mask grants the anonymity that brings out bad behaviors. But no, not really, because the mask is never worn during the bad behavior.
Yeah.
Instead, the mask imparts an altered, disturbed state of mind, and then the person goes out and does bad things. So it's drugs, right?
Yeah.
Like you have a bad trip wearing the mask, and then you go out and you do bad things.
Which made me do a little bit of research. I know we're past the context setting part of the podcast, but here's a little bit more.
Yeah.
So I was like, well, I know that it was pretty notable in media for like media as in like newspapers, for Bela Lugosi to go into rehab so publicly. That's 1955. So only 6 years before this. Now, Alcoholics Anonymous was established in 1935. So, you know, it's not like the idea of an addiction is new. And then I was like, well, they keep emphasizing psychiatry. So while LSD was first like created or synthesized or whatever in 1938, and its hallucinogenic effects were discovered in 1943, through the 50s and 60s, psychiatrists trialed LSD to treat alcoholism to relatively successful rates. And so I think you could see, I don't know how addictive LSD is, but you can see a parallel here of the mask and how like intense the nightmare trip is with even like the first time.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I think that's a really great thing to point out, because LSD was something that a lot of people thought was going to be this like miracle drug in a way that would like open up the human mind for psychologists, expand the mind of the user, you know, bring us to heightened states of awareness. And then it turned out to be really destructive, and like you can have really bad trips on LSD and it can like destroy people's minds. So I think you're kind of hitting the nail right on the head with that. And speaking of which, you know, this movie's about drugs and addiction. It's also about mental health.
Yes.
And, you know, Barnes is a psychiatrist. There's this debate in the movie about whether the changes wrought by the mask are psychological or mystical. Like I was talking about earlier when I was rambling about Jungian things, from a symbolic POV, there may be like no difference. Like if...
Oh, between mystic and science?
Yeah.
Okay.
Like if we take like a magical point of view, and what the mask is doing is imparting these visions of a bygone age into your subconscious so that you will go out and enact like violence against women, I guess. You know, that's one explanation. But if wearing the mask sort of brings out things in your subconscious that are influenced by what you think of the mask, and then that makes you go out and do those things, then like there's no functional difference between it being magical and psychological. Like, I guess what I'm saying is one of the points in the favor of, oh, it's magical, is like the visions include these like priests and this altar and these ruins, right? And so it's like, why would your subconscious be showing you the mask's prehistory, right? But we learn that the mask is from Tikal, that it's Mayan. The ruins don't really like look Mayan. It's like a bunch of dudes in like Sith robes, like going around. And so I wonder if it, you know, you could explain that as being that's Barnes's subconscious creating a vision in his mind of what the mask's, you know, tribal prehistory is like without actually knowing anything about it, right?
The head priest is played by the actor who plays Raiden.
Yeah, with his eye falling out.
Well, it progressively gets worse, but yes.
And
because
so,
that's where he shot himself, to be clear.
Yes. And so I think the more potent suggestion is that of the mask driving on what's already there, which suggests that Barnes may have already been troubled before he puts on the mask. And he is troubled by like the loss of his patient, the fact that this guy came to him for help and he didn't help him, and now this guy is dead, right? I think it's likely that textually in the film, the mask is meant to be like real, like the magic is meant to be real. It's very much like the One Ring kind of style of evil cursed object temptation, but we never see Michael's visions.
Which I think would have been very interesting. And I think also I'd like to bring up that Pam has no like visions of her own when she's with the mask.
Right. And so because we don't have Michael's visions to compare to Alan's, it could all be a product of psychosis. If we were seeing both men's visions and they both saw the same weirdo priests and altar and shit, then like, yeah, it's magic, right? Regardless, I think someone on the team making this movie knew someone with a drug addiction or knew someone with psychological problems or both, because there are certain elements that ring very true to me, like the requests for help that are met with kind of an angry insistence that no one can help them. Like the whole sequences where Michael comes to Barnes and he's like, you have to help me, you have to help me. And then Barnes is like, okay, well, how would you like me to help you? And then Michael's like, you could never help me. No one can help me. You don't know what's going on.
Or even the way that Barnes begs for Quincy's help and then refuses it.
Yes. Like this is stuff that rings very true about the behavior of people with mental health issues, of people with addiction problems, that kind of stuff. As for the idea that, you know, the mask has no effect on Pam, that could be because nothing magical is going on. And so there's no, you know, Pam's not disturbed. It's not drawing on those ideas for Pam. It's not having that psychosomatic effect on Pam, where, you know, if you believe that the mask has an effect, it'll have an effect. But even if we accept the mask as magical, if we take the text at its word, she's not troubled in the same way. Or as Alan puts it in his own dialogue, she is so very innocent that the mask has nothing to draw out of her. If what the mask does is draw the evil out from you, like the dialogue makes a point of saying that like Pam is so innocent and good.
That's very funny because she blatantly lies to the police. So this movie's like a cab.
Yeah, absolutely.
And like is like, yeah, don't squeal to the cops. So I think the other thing I want to make sure we call out here with this movie kind of goes back to the way that you were like, William Castle, eat your heart out.
Oh, yeah.
The gimmick here of the mask you get in the theater and you put it on when we see Barnes wear the mask is very well integrated. And I really appreciated that, like, in the context of the movie, Barnes is hearing this voice of like, put the mask on now. But it's also very helpful for the audience to go like, oh, okay, let me put my popcorn down. Let me get my mask. And now I'm ready to like see what happens. I appreciated the voiceover telling me what to do and that being integrated, not like let me pause the movie and be like, now is the ticking time bomb. Put on your mask or else. Yeah.
Like there's no card that comes up that's like, put your 3D glasses on now. Instead, it's fully integrated into the narrative. The voice that he's hearing is, I think it's meant to be Michael's because it starts the first time he reads that letter. And it sort of continues from that voiceover. And then we're just hearing it every other time he wants to put the mask on. But you're completely right. This is gimmick integration done well, right?
And I like the idea of like when you put on your mask, you are seeing his visions.
Yeah.
You're seeing through the eyes of the mask. My only thing is that the mask that you have as an audience member looks nothing like the bejeweled skull mask he's putting on.
Yeah, that's
I think
really
that
disappointing.
could have been better.
It's got the vibes of like
Dragon Halloween eye mask.
Yeah, and like maybe a sense that like the whatever company they got to make those masks like didn't see the movie.
Yeah.
You know? So that's like a bit of a nitpick. I also think that the sound in this movie bears mentioning.
Yeah, we've heard worse 100%, but we kind of mentioned this earlier, the dialogue can be really hard to hear. We had to crank up on our stereo to hear it.
But I think the sound design is quite good.
Yes.
The dramatic score during the 2D sections is really quite rousing and effective. And then there's like an electronic score during the 3D parts, which is even better. It has all these like disturbing tones and like piercing zings that really like set your hair on end and enhance the horror and make you feel uneasy. And it feels very modern in that way, where like instead of something scary happening and you get this like, ba-na on the score, instead it's like this like deep low electronic like rumbling sounds that make you feel really on edge, and then like these little like high-pitched wailing sounds. And it
feels very otherworldly.
Yes, and very cool and very like effective. I know you really appreciate good sound design and good music and stuff. And yeah, absolutely.
Well, Ben, do you feel ready to move on to ranking?
Yes, I'm worried, but yes.
Why are you worried?
I'm looking quite high.
Okay.
And so I'm worried about what'll happen if you're not looking as high as I am.
When picking out a range, I don't know if I would say I have a range. I have areas of interest for this. But I really tried to do some self-reflection to make sure I wasn't accidentally biased with the fact that this is the first Canadian movie.
Sure.
But I don't think so. I think this is a really strong movie, and I really do recommend people seeing this.
I mean, it made $1.5 million at the box office when it came out, and it came out in theaters in America through Warner Brothers. So, Americans liked it.
Yeah. So, some movies I kind of want to, put as waypoints for us. So, we mentioned Jigoku. It had that very hell imagery. So Jigoku is ranked at number 14. We covered it in episode 300. And then we kept mentioning William Castle. So I believe our highest ranked Castle film is sort of his most recent. It's Homicidal at number 28. And then the next, his most recent one, which we didn't quite like, Mr. Sardonicus, is at number 214. So I just like to have waypoints to help guide the conversation.
Yeah.
What is your range?
So I went looking for Jigoku as my point of comparison. So as you mentioned, that's at 14. And I was looking kind of up and down from there. Looking below Jigoku, trying to decide what do I think this is definitely better than? And there's a lot of really good stuff up here, right? We're in the top 20. So The Picture of Dorian Gray is really incredible. Isle of the Dead is really great. Invisible Man. But I do think I liked this better than Taste of Fear, which is sitting at 21. Mm-hmm. That was the sort of weird double twist movie of the girl in the wheelchair. And that's very gothic and has a lot of those gothic vibes that you really like in things.
It did have you going, what the fuck is happening?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It was a good movie, but it also was a case of, what we talk about a lot in this show, which is doing things we've seen before, but doing them really well, right? Yeah. It's a diabolique riff mixed with a kind of Jane Eyre, you know what I mean?
Yeah. And the gimmick of color in Picture of Dorian Gray was incredibly well integrated.
Yes. So I think I like this better than Taste of Fear. I think it's more creative. I think it's pushing the boundaries of horror more. I think I enjoyed this more than Taste of Fear, which, I still really like Taste of Fear. Obviously, it's at 21 here. And then looking up from Jigoku, there's some also really impressive stuff. We have two Corman pictures here, Pit and the Pendulum and Fall of the House of Usher, which also have weird dream sequence elements that are cool, but aren't as cool as The Mask. So my range is 11 to 21 Like somewhere in, it doesn't make top 10 for me. I don't think this is better than I Walked with a Zombie, but it makes top 20 for me, somewhere between, 10 and 20 here.
Cool. Where I was looking is within your range.
Okay.
So similarly, I looked at Jigoku, and Pit and the Pendulum is right above that. And yeah, I also found the similarities with the dream sequences and everything really fitting. Pit and the Pendulum is a bit more reliant on a narrative in those dream sequences than Fall of the House of Usher. And I think Fall of the House of Usher does a really fantastic job around the atmosphere.
Mm-hmm.
Looking down, I also kind of came to Taste of Fear, but I specifically was drawn to Isle of the Dead.
Mm-hmm.
And, that movie is so because it's based on just an island. And so it feels kind of claustrophobic. And I think the pacing of The Mask kind of feels that same way of there's no way to get off this roller coaster ride, especially for Barnes. That's kind of how sometimes addiction can be described of I don't have control. I'm just on this path.
Mm-hmm.
But I really enjoyed Taste of Fear. I really enjoy City of the Dead at 23,
Mm-hmm.
which I think handles that balance of atmosphere and gothic and all of that. But I knew that I could not go below Homicidal at 28 because of the problem I have with that movie's gimmick interruption.
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting to think about how Homicidal is talking about psychology. We're seeing that in The Mask and these movies coming after Psycho, which was so explicitly about it. So I think this is a trend we're going to be seeing. We're seeing it done very, very well here. But I because of that problem I have with Homicidal's gimmick and how well it's handled in The Mask, I did not feel comfortable going below 28. So my range is kind of Pit and the Pendulum, 13 to 28.
Got it. So it's just shifts a little bit lower than mine.
Yeah.
So I think a central question we have to answer first then is, do we like this better or worse than Jigoku? One of the things with Jigoku is it's got this really incredible hell imagery with all these ironic punishments and really cool, interesting visuals. But, and this isn't necessarily a bad thing, but we have to compare movies, right? Yeah. In Jigoku, it takes a long time to get there. A lot of the first chunk of the movie is normal. It's not really a horror movie.
I would say it's 2/3 and then the last third.
Yeah, it's like a kitchen sink drama for the first 2/3 because it has to set up why all of these people deserve to be in hell, right? And then it goes into the hell stuff and becomes a horror movie.
And I feel the hell section feel almost short ellipses, segments or episodes that don't really have a narrative going through beyond guy wandering through hell. Yeah. And even then, maybe it was partly because it's a Japanese movie, but I had a hard time following even the ending of the spirits going up into heaven. Whereas in The Mask, in terms of narrative, you could probably map some of the imagery in the nightmares to Barnes's life, but they are still pretty separate. But because it's these 3 episodes throughout, it feels better integrated.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Jigoku, of course, is in color, which makes it, able to do a lot of really cool looking imagery. But yeah, man, The Mask's really good.
I would be willing to go above Jigoku, but I think then it's a matter of discussing Pit and the Pendulum. Because while the dream sequence, or memory sequence,
yeah,
really,
it's like a flashback.
Yeah, while that, is not as good as the surrealist sequence we get in Fall of the House of Usher, the psychological themes throughout are so strong, and we see someone literally go mad. I think that might be a little stronger.
Okay. What are some other things that you think Pit and the Pendulum does better than The Mask?
I think part of it is that cohesion of like our narrator isn't right in the head, like the guy who arrives at the castle.
Mm-hmm.
I liked the twists and turns of like, you know, the Gothic storytelling. I will say it's probably, you could add some distance between yourself and what's happening on screen because it's a period piece, whereas The Mask is like contemporary. I really liked how The Mask was like, you know, Barnes is like, but I'm built different. I can handle one hit.
You sure?
And that being famous last words for people who get addicted to really strong drugs. Like,
mm-hmm.
So it feels very human in that way as well.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, whereas Pit and the Pendulum's like, you know, off in Gothic fantasy land.
Yeah, which I think is to its benefit. But when we're comparing, it does limit it. It's all in color. So if I remember correctly, the dream sequence was like all one color, is like monochromatic.
Yeah. They're like in like a purple.
Yeah.
That they created by like, if I'm remembering correctly, like tinting the black and white footage red and then toning it blue or something like that to make it purple.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's tough. Like Corman is consistently hitting the ball out of the park.
Yeah.
Julian Roffman, he does this and then goes, puh, horror.
Yeah.
So I'm like, oh, do we want to reward that attitude?
If I were to sit you down and I said to you like, hey, we're going to watch a movie tonight. You only have two choices and you can't choose to not watch anything. The choices are Pit and the Pendulum or The Mask.
I think I would probably choose The Mask because I don't know what their actual lengths are, but I think it feels shorter, whereas The Pit and the Pendulum could feel a bit more meandering because it has that mystery we're trying to solve.
Sure.
What about you?
It's tough. Part of me doesn't want to put The Mask above Jigoku because I really like Jigoku as like an artistic film, but I think The Mask, you know, knows what audiences want, and it gets us to the first dream sequence. The Mask gives you what you want. The only thing it doesn't give you is like Barnes actually killing people, right? In real life. But like right away, it's like, this is a horror movie, you know? Mm-hmm. And it gets to the point. And so if The Mask is better than Jigoku, I kind of feel like it's better than Pit and the Pendulum. I like Pit and the Pendulum a lot, but it's very comic booky. It's very fantasy. Yes, we get to watch Vincent Price go mad, but it's a very like
chewing the scenery gone mad?
It's very like cackling madness, whereas like we see Barnes's mind fall apart in a much more like believable way. That said, I know that Pit and the Pendulum was kind of around your ceiling, right?
Yeah, because so above that at 12 is Tokaido Yotsuya Kaiden.
Yes, the best Yotsuya Kaiden.
Yes. Which I think just given the fact that it has such a mainstay in culture.
I think that Yotsuya Kaiden, this Yotsuya Kaiden, which is also like the most stripped down, get to the point Yotsuya Kaiden.
They know what we want to see.
Yeah. Also does like the stuff with Oiwa in Tokaido Yotsuya Kaiden, the stuff with her haunting Yemen in that movie is like really strong.
It is, yes.
And it's really like, this is a ghost story. This is a horror movie.
And it's also a revenge story. So like you're invested and you're cheering for her. You're not really cheering for anyone in The Mask. Like you don't even get enough of Lieutenant Martin to cheer for him.
Yeah. No. The Mask is sort of just watching a bunch of people like circle a drain.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, would you be okay if this went above Pit and the Pendulum, but below Yotsuya Kaiden?
Yes, I think so.
Okay. Well, then entering the list at the new number 13 is The Mask from 1961, directed by Julian Roffman.
If you would like to see this list, you can go to our website, screamscenepodcast.com. There you can find links to the other movies that we have mentioned, as well as our appeals box. If you would like to contest this or any other ranking, you can drop us a line through our Ask box on Tumblr, or you can email us at screamscenepodcast@gmail.com, or talk to us on Blue Sky.
Scream Scene updates every other Wednesday on SoundCloud and Spotify and iTunes and all those other podcasting apps. If you want to make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe to our RSS feed. If you want to help support the show, tell a friend about it. Share the show online, share links. Word of mouth is the best way for a podcast to grow its audience. And if you really like what we do, head on over to patreon.com/Scream Scene Podcast, where you can become a patron of the night for as little as $1 a month and help us pay for things like hosting fees and, research and movies and streaming subscriptions and everything else that goes into making this show a reality. So check that out at patreon.com/Scream Scene Podcast.
So Ben, what are we watching next week?
Next week, Sarah, we are back to Mexico. Which is ironic because right now at work, we're showing a series of Mexican horror films. And we are checking out a movie called El Mundo Los Vampiros.
Something about vampires? El Mundo. What's El Mundo?
The World of the Vampires.
Oh, okay. Well, we will see you then, creatures of the night.
Bye.
Bye.